Hello and greetings, everyone. It's Mr. Tilbury here, and let's talk about World of Warcraft! So, World of Warcraft has been around for a long time, and during its run, it's undergone a plethora of changes. WoW is a complex, ever-evolving animal, and its face changes with every expansion, so the purpose of this video is to rank and discuss my thoughts on the various eras that the game has underwent. Admittedly, this is no easy task. It's extremely difficult to go about this subject logically, as the gaming experience is usually complicated by the many factors that are inherent to an MMORPG, such as the people that you encounter, or maybe there was an expansion era out there that was there for you during a tough time in your life. Or maybe the opposite. People always have a really good reason for taking this game extremely seriously, myself included. That's because I've been a WoW player since the late spring of 2004. Yes, I said spring, not fall, for I was one of the lucky ones to have access to the beta of the original World of Warcraft, and the Warcraft series is one that is very old and dear to me, having started my fandom all the way back in 1995's Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness.
The orcish hordes lay vanquished as the triumphant armies of the Alliance stood vigil over the evil gateway that had brought the orcs into Azeroth.
Given everything that I've said so far, I feel it necessary to forego my customary spoiler warning in favor of a disclaimer. These are my reflections and opinions on a profoundly subjective gaming experience. Therefore, I absolutely guarantee that I will say something that you disagree with. Also, this video is not intended to recap every feature in every expansion. Like, I don't even bring up pet battles because why? I mean, otherwise this will take hours. I'll be presenting them in order of my favorites, starting from the bottom, but that does not make this a top 7 countdown. That would be insanity. Let's kick this off right. The 5th expansion of World of Warcraft definitely takes it in terms of earning my ire. Warlords of Draenor needs to be knocked out of this discussion first, because, just like in real life, this expansion needs to be forgotten about immediately. When Warlords was first introduced at BlizzCon, there was a unique reaction from the crowd. Instead of the roaring cheers and gasps, it was more contemplative confusion, a sweeping unfolding and failing of expectations in a single motion, until they said new character models. The fans reacted to this expansion the same way a dog reacts when it hears an unfamiliar sound, because the story here is completely bizarre and baffling. The problem is that Warlords serviced the nostalgia of the old-school Blizzard crew, such as Chris Metzen, more so than acknowledged the needs and desires of the fanbase. Honestly, this expansion catered to fans like me, people who have been with the Warcraft franchise for 20 years and pine for the old days of the Horde, especially the Warcraft 2 era. However, this expansion made me realize that digging up these old bones was a fun thought, but never sustainable. This was more fan fiction than reliable content. Though this was not a total loss, as we finally got a spectacular display of the Orc homeworld, something that the Burning Crusade really dropped the ball on. However, from a mechanical standpoint, there was very little in the way of innovation, and the amount of worthwhile content was bizarrely bare. I will heap praise on the overall quest design and flow of the world, and Blizzard brought their A-game with the leveling experience, but Warlords ultimately piggybacked on many of the things that Mists of Pandaria did first, especially Timeless Isle. But Warlords' true hallmark was garrisons, which Blizzard implemented to offer their players a chance to create a tangible footprint in the world, and I applaud that, but despite their attempt at making them organic and relevant, it eventually just added a thick layer of grind and busywork. Legion's class halls were touted as improvements in every way for this reason. Personally though, what grinded my gears about Warlords wasn't the batshit crazy story or the lack of new ideas. It was the classes! While overall class balance was about par for the course, Warlords brought about extremely excessive pruning of abilities. Some builds, like Arms Warrior, got hit so badly by this that their theory crafting actually included auto-attacking and waiting for luck as opposed to actually using abilities. And it wasn't just Warrior. Classes in Warlords were an afterthought. And if you don't believe me or don't agree, I refer you once again to Legion's announcements. Blizzard made it loud and clear that redoing classes were on the forefront of their minds. That's how badly Warlords sucked at it. Putting it together, you had poor class direction, excess busywork, unfulfilling mechanics, and weak patches, making the Warlords of Draenor experience dull, token, and largely worthless. Not to mention that the content drought, as defined by a period in between released content, was well over 14 months long. That's just unreal. Truly, this expansion is notable as being a Congo line of empty promises, not just because of the huge amount of cut content. This expansion's existence was justified as a means to bring about an epic story involving the old war chiefs, but the way it played out was generally unfulfilling and token. Plus, Grom Hellscream's arc and final resolution was redundant and unsatisfying. If you want to see Grom Hellscream done right, just go play Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos. Truly, this expansion was overwhelmingly underwhelming. Honestly, if you want a stellar breakdown of how badly Blizzard screwed up in Warlords of Draenor, my research led me to this post by someone named Amuli in February of 2015. This person spells out this expansion's issues even better than I can. I also found a really good article from Polygon talking about the overall execution of Warlords, and both of those links are in the description. I really recommend reading them both. In summation, I feel Warlords was a very just low point for Blizzard, and the dip in population is nothing to ignore to that end. Good thing Legion has been a pretty damn good apology. So far. Oh man, you're gonna hate me. Oh dear, I put BC low on the list. Fiddlesticks! I've long been a critic of the Burning Crusade era, though I am fast to clarify that the Burning Crusade was the most important expansion in the game's history. However, it suffered from a lot of pitfalls that are often overlooked because everyone was so giddy about the game that we just didn't care. Yet, BC is the sacred cow amongst the older crowd, more or less the fan favorite of the raiding community, or at least a small group of vocal jackfucks who hold on to this era so tightly they can't see it for the continuous dredge through savagely mediocre content that it was. And don't worry, I'll go over the great things about Burning Crusade as well. BC introduced something that improved the game more drastically than any other facet of any other expansion ever, and I'll reveal what that is. But first, I'm old, I'm bitter, I've still got some bones to pick. The proverbial elephant in the room in BC's failures was Blizzard's naivete in PvP and PvE balance. Blizzard legitimately tried to balance the two as a singular entity, which is something that Blizzard has since openly lamented. If you didn't know or don't remember, this was an era before abilities and spells had adjusted effects on monsters and players. Since Wrath, Blizzard has slowly separated the two, and modern WoW has long standardized this concept, with abilities having altered math and effects on players and monsters. But back then they tried to make the two harmonious, but there are so many mathematical differences between player numbers and monster numbers that this balance inevitably led to a lot of broken classes and abilities. Additionally, strategic, like DPS rotations were still in the process of becoming a thing, and most people just mash their keyboards like drunken monkeys anyway. I mean, Restoration Shamans spent their entire raiding life just spamming chain heal and nothing else, so this expansion did not require skillful or thoughtful input anyway. And speaking of poor game balance, anyone who complains about modern WoW's homogenized approach to stats and gear has clearly overlooked how problematic and unintuitive BC's philosophy towards class attributes was. Those playing mages and warlocks laughed their way to the bank, stacking intellect and spirit and MP5 and spell pen or whatever the fuck else, but say hunter, paladin, and shaman were stuck needing way too many stats. For example, hunter needed agility for attack power and crit, but they also had mana, so they needed intellect. Ooh, but not too much intellect because that would ruin the agility and attack power stacking game, but enough. And since hunters had mana and ran out blisteringly fast, they also need a little spear and an MP5 so they could actually play their class. A little stamina didn't hurt either, since PvP was balanced into this. Oh, and don't forget hit! Motherfucking gameplay tax bullshit. The joke, all gear is hunter gear, was perpetuated by this very thing I'm describing. Hunter gearing options were simply unclear to strategize. Some hunters even thought that strength was a good idea because back then there was something called the Hunter Dead Zone and we had melee abilities. Check the description for a link to a forum thread from 2007 debating this very thing. And remember, the loot was a lot harder to get back then. This muddy visualization of optimization necessitated band-aid abilities like Aspect of the Viper, which those were boring. Enhancement Shaman was a similar story, needing strength and attack power for actual damage, and every other stat for every other thing. And Paladins, then freshly christened as legitimate tanks for this expansion, spent their freshman year in the tank business, out of mana, out of spells, out of threat, and out of life. All because the attribute system in the Burning Crusade was designed by literal baboons. Certainly, I don't wish to imply that the game was a broken mess. It was actually very fun and progressive for its day, and lots of people really liked all those extra stats like block and MP5 and socket bonuses and all that dumb shit. And I played BC a lot. I was part of several good guilds with whom I cleared many raids with, and had a lot of great friends on both Alliance and Horde. I played an Undead Rogue in PvP for a time, and an arena team with my hunter, and I absolutely loved it. However, from a story perspective, this expansion really pissed me off. Despite the fact that we were on the fucking orc fucking home fucking world, everything about the narrative was dominated by Blood Elves. I was insanely excited for Blood Elves upon their announcement, but the entire expansion was so focused on them that Blizzard seemed completely uninterested in the Orc and Draenei history, just slapping ruins here and there without giving them any real attention. Being a Warcraft enthusiast, it was my wet dream to explore Outland and even get to know the Draenei better, but this was completely passed on for elves, elves, elves. What a waste. So in total we had poor specialization balance, bad stat building, wasted story potential. Am I forgetting something? I feel like there was one other thing that sucked about BC. Just one, though. What was it? Oh! Now. In fairness, I did say that the Burning Crusade came up with something incredible that I feel is well worth praising. Its greatest trait, to me, was creating the opportunity for all specializations to have a place, i.e., hybrid DPS. Remember that? I complained about shamans and paladin stats, but the fact that a shaman could enter a raid as something other than restoration was a colossal step forward for the health of the game and the community, as Classic WoW was just a great big ol' shoehorn. Back then, classes had no choice of role to be effective. Warriors were tanks, paladins were healers, deal with it. The stats on tier gear reflected this, but BC was the first time Blizzard decided to open the gates to explore other ways to play successfully, which was crucial for the longevity of the game. While other expansions would capitalize and balance this better over time, it was the BC content cluster that first put it into motion. In fact, this expansion invented many things that Classic did not have, many of which are still staples of modern gameplay. Not to mention the creation of flying mounts and the successful implementation of the game's first new races. And to be honest, for their day and their time, many of the dungeons and raids were of excellent quality, especially Karazhan, which was the first ever 10-man raid, which opened the gates to Wrath's 10 and 25-mans, and Pandaria's flex rating. Quell the Nos was pretty cool too, and those super hard heroic dungeons really taught people how to play. Also, BC created the emblem system, which helped alleviate poor luck with drops, which lasted all the way until around the time of Pandaria and Warlords. So, while modernized WoW may have come a very, 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 very long way, BC's long-term contribution was a paramount stage in evolution. And hey, I may be bitching about it, but BC has a lot of admirers. But at the end of the day, do you really want to know what it was like to play during this era? Here's what you do. Warp to Shathrath City and spend 3 hours there. You feel that depressing, empty feeling? Imagine that. spread over almost 2 years. That's BC in a nutshell. Now that I've gotten the 2 expansions that I outright hated out of the way, let's look at 2 conflicted time periods. Cataclysm is probably the most wild expansion to talk about because it's responsible for some of the greatest content ever seen in the history of the game. But it also started many of the trends that are credited to killing the game. Broadly, I do think Cataclysm was a very good expansion in terms of design intention, but its major downfall was fizzling out in the later stages. Reinvention was its core philosophy, and it was coming from a good place, as it brought then-modern quest design to zones that were very old, wiping away outdated quests from Blizzard's era of amateurism, and gave a welcome focus on the old Azeroth, which was abandoned in the 2 expansions before it. Cataclysm also introduced a significant amount of story shakeups because the original WoW's story was growing stale and needed a good kick in the balls. Additionally, Blizzard's class rebalancing demonstrated a great amount of philosophical maturation. We also saw the return of challenging 5-man heroics, which addressed complaints that the Wrath heroics were just too easy. Cataclysm's heroics required teamwork and CC, just like Burning Crusade. Lastly, the opening raids were extremely good, and Firelands was fucking excellent. Bonus trivia, I think Firelands is my all-time favorite raid, plus the introduction of transmogrification was a dream come true for me personally. However, with all this good came many catches. The massive zone changes were an excuse for Blizzard to pull a George Lucas on the Azeroth we all loved for 6 years and toss it in the incinerator, which upset a lot of faithful fans. Number 2, the aforementioned story shakeups mostly involved many of our favorite characters acting like dumbasses, and Thrall/Go fucking L was totally ruined. As the old saying goes, love Thrall, hate Goel. Number 3, the class rebalances were so ambitious the game was broken at launch, requiring the first major content patch, 4.1, to fix it. Number 4, the freshly pruned talent trees were showing age and they were no longer interactive. And number 5, the difficulty of heroics coming off of Wrath was a shock for a lot of people, pushing them away. The only unanimously good thing about Cataclysm were the raids, at least the first 2 tiers. Luckily for me, I was connected with a wonderful guild on Moonguard, and my raid buddies started cracking into 10-man and later 25-man heroic raid content, so personally, I had a wonderfully good and profitable time raiding. However, while raiding was fun, there wasn't much else to do in the endgame besides grind heroics all day, unless you like Tol Barad. But in regards to those story shakeups, well, you see, the great and terrible thing about Blizzard is that they often act as a factory for big, bold, larger-than-life heroes, and Warcraft is rarely characterized by things like quiet introspection, rather boisterous action set pieces. Blizzard got famous in the 90s and early 2000s for their use of big, crazy comic book-style melodrama and excessively badass characters, and they tried to recapture that spark for Cataclysm, but it ultimately went nowhere. They brought back classic characters like Cho'Gall just for him to stand around and, just be a fun raid fight with no real ramifications to the story. And then there's the long-awaited arrival of Corona! Alright, now if you've read The Last Guardian like me, then you know that she is one of the greatest characters in the game that is sorely underutilized. But all they did was retcon her banging Medivh and gave birth to The Last Airbender. Cool. Sylvanas started using unsavory methods for her army. Would you like to develop this further? No? Are we gonna see what happens in Stone Talon Mountains? Will the orcs ever stop invading Ashenvale? Are any of these plots going to be resolved? Blizzard set out to add new life to the story by returning to the roots, but all we got was a great big mess of unfinished threads and half-assed attempts at characterization and aggro! I need a moment. Another crock in my shawl is how many of the new Alliance leveling quests portrayed the Horde acting in some generically and exclusively evil way, which is an insult to the original intention of WoW's Horde. To summarize Cataclysm's story, Deathwing breaks the world, Thrall becomes Jesus hates Christ, and the Horde are now stereotypically evil, and 5 million plots are created and abandoned. Story grievances aside, let's look at the infamous end of the expansion. The final patch gave us Dragon Soul and 3 short dungeons to do, and then Blizzard just stopped making content for the expansion for 10 months. And not only was Dragon Soul a disappointing finale in terms of gameplay content, but the actual ending to the story of the expansion, as in Deathwing's demise and the dragon aspects, was absolute reprehensible garbage. Blizzard tried really, really hard to recapture some of the magic that they had with Arthas when they touted Deathwing as our great big bad finale, but it all ended up just aggressively adequate. Seriously, how do you fuck up something so easily epic? I have theories, but that would take too much time in an already bloated video. And as for that content drought, Blizzard at the time decided that more expansions equaled more money, so Blizzard pulled from their current content teams to churn out as many expansions as possible, leaving the current players at the time in the dark. Cataclysm had phenomenal potential and brought about welcome innovations and started very strong, but just sort of burned itself out. Blizzard released a series of water cooler interviews in 2011 where they reveal where they think Cataclysm went wrong, and while you may disagree with me or Blizzard as to when or where it went wrong, it's nonetheless absolutely evident that something did go wrong, and I'll provide that link in the description. The thing is though, I usually defend Cataclysm from detractors because I had a hell of a good time playing the game during its reign. But, you gotta be honest, it is guilty for killing the game's momentum.
For my kind, the true question is, what is worth fighting for?
Mist of Pandaria? Vastly underrated. At the time, many players turned their noses up for a variety of reasons, but thanks to Warlords, I feel Mists is already being vindicated by history. Ask yourself an important question. How can Mist of Pandaria be the worst expansion when Warlords of Draenor exists? Mist's marketing was admittedly poor, and Blizzard failed to communicate how this had nothing to do with Jack Black. And if you think that Pandarians had anything to do with Kung Fu Panda, then you're an ignorant cunt. Mist of Pandaria featured some of the most beautiful designs, the most wonderful and unique locales, a gorgeous and nearly unparalleled MMO soundtrack, and its themes were relevant in a post-Cataclysm Azeroth. Thematically, its core message was placed on peace and healing, a serene foreground that heeds the dangers and horrors of war. Mists had a good story for this reason, as the idea of patience and kindness and the protection from corruption were the key ingredients to Pandaria's motifs. Also that Garrosh could come in and fuck it all up. I feel this expansion started to heal the Cataclysm character failures by reintroducing nuance and intrigue alongside the big action moments, though unfortunately they did go out of their way to ruin entirely the great Jaina Proudmoore. But let's talk about our main man, Garrosh Hellscream. Oh man, is he one hell of a controversial character. I don't know if I can think of any other more wildly received character. Get the fuck out of here, Madon! Though I think Garrosh's journey, when mapped from his humble beginnings in the Burning Crusade to his final death in Warlords, turned out more than okay. I was one of the many people who blasted the character throughout Wrath and Cataclysm, outright hating Blizzard's piss-poor attempts at characterization, but then MOP made me reconsider things. Blizzard had the steep task of creating a new villain character in a world with a rich legacy, and Mists brought about a surprisingly good climax. Garrosh is by no means Blizzard's best character, but Mists made me realize that I had underestimated his potential as a character and a villain.
You left me to pick up your pieces. You failed me.
I'm with Garrosh on that one. I mean, we held Garrosh accountable when he fucked up. Perhaps we could do the same for you, Thrall. You know, maybe make it interesting again.
You disappoint me, Garrosh.
But let's talk about Pandaria, the continent, though. Blizzard crafted an amazingly organic world that seemed to breathe on its own, and to this day has never been replicated. This world had its own original and unique history, races, languages, places to explore. Exploration hadn't been a rewarding notion since the classic and vanilla era, which is cool. Mists wasn't a slouch on innovation either, giving us a fantastic new class. The monk was a blast to play, and its animations were on a whole other level at their time. But the true star of the innovation show is the Timeless Isle, which laid the groundwork that warlords and legions still follow. In my opinion, the Timeless Isle may have contained the single greatest amount of innovation and experimentation in any one singular spot in the history of the game. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was an excellent test grounds. But with Pandaria, of course, came some bad. It inherited Cataclysm's content drought, leaving us a good year with no content after Siege of Orgrimmar. And oddly, I felt Mists was very lacking in the dungeons and raid department. I'm not sure why, but the raids kind of sucked in Pandaria. The Throne of Thunder and Siege of Orgrimmar had a handful of great moments, but they were otherwise just insanely long and tiresome, and despite some good art direction in the dungeons, the armor in this era wasn't appealing to me. Pandaria's heroic dungeons, which were mostly hit or miss on the design front, were returned to an easier difficulty because Blizzard was pushing other content such as challenge modes and scenarios as alternative ways to play. Mists also went way overboard on dailies, especially at launch. Dailies were so intense at the beginning of Mist to Pandaria that it is almost trite to call them out at this point. Blizzard was all like, "Hey guys, we found an island, and it's full of daily quests, and it's been hidden this whole time. Enjoy!" Is there anything else to talk about? Well, Cross Realms, which was a thing. You know, that time Blizzard wanted to avoid the negative press of shutting down servers because Mist of Pandaria failed to rebound the population after Cataclysm's failure, so they just merged servers. Because that was a thing. Hey, does anyone remember battle groups in Classic? That was cool. In the end, though, Mist of Pandaria was brutalized by naysayers, and far too many people deliberately skipped this expansion. But you know what? Do yourself a favor after this video and head back to Pandaria. Crank up your graphics and just walk. Be calm, be patient, breathe, and look at this vibrant and beautiful and rich world that Blizzard crafted. Take a moment and appreciate the rare gift that was Pandaria. Also, pandas are awesome. Fuck you. Maybe one day I'll look back on this list and regret this, but you know what? So far, Legion's been really fucking cool. I'll keep this brief because Legion is still new and proving itself, but Blizzard seems to have effectively taken the game by the cojones and enriched the things that expansions tried to do, all while giving us a rich dollop of creamy fan service. Class halls are a significant improvement on garrisons, and world quests are surprisingly delightful. One thing that Warlords and Pandaria attempted that Legion did even better was offer alternative content other than heroics and raiding. In a broad sense, Blizzard really learned their lessons and all the mistakes that they've made in the past when they've attempted this before. The fact that Legion provides an entertaining and profitable endgame content outside of heroic dungeon grinding fixes a problem that dates back to the Burning Crusade, with Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm being the worst offenders, though the real downside of Legion's endgame issues may be seen in the grind for legendaries, as the luck-based system seems to get a lot of people down. I mean, it's cool, but not perfect, as the specialization-specific legendaries make or break competitive builds. But at the forefront of Legion is class innovation. Every class I've stepped into feels far more dynamic, and actually playing the game has been a delight, a far cry from Warlords. The dungeons and raids are pretty damn good, and that whole undead elf minigame is strangely super fun. Also, the concept of choosing the order in which you tackle the new areas is really revolutionary, and I'm interested to see if Blizzard evolves this further down the line. Well, then I'm gonna stop myself here. Legion's too new to make grandiose comments about its achievements, but I did want to place it on the list and talk about how much promise it shows. At the time of making this video, the final raid patch in Legion is up and running, and we are finally on fucking Argus. Also, if you're wondering why it took me from May to September to post a bigger video than my movie impressions ones, it's because while I was getting the footage, I became addicted to the game again and lost a month. Or 2. 3.
Decades.
I haven't had this much fun in the game in years, so here's hoping Legion keeps a good thing going. Alright, let's get this over with. Oh yeah, the original, the great, the universally worshipped World of Warcraft. Yay! Yeah, I know it's not an expansion and the title of the video is ranking expansions, but that doesn't mean I can't talk about the original World of Warcraft as a frame of reference. Classic WoW has been praised to high heavens, and my own level of excitement during this time was unparalleled. But it wasn't all the roses people claim it to be. It actually had a veritable swarm of bugs and balance issues compared to the modern age. In its day, the Burning Crusade was considered a huge improvement. And I've already told you how I feel about BC. Yet in no other time period of the game did it possess a more passionate population, and the community in this time was extraordinary to be a part of. Sure, there were jerks and trolls, and jerks who played trolls, and the forums were a dumpster fire, but there was a permeable cloud of dedication and eagerness that everyone shared. Perhaps it was because WoW took all the elements of other MMOs at the time and created something greater than the sum of its parts, or maybe it was the brand that existed beforehand. Sure, the classes were unbalanced as hell at launch, and PvP sucked and required dozens of patches to fix, but, you know, so what? Back then, quest chains were long and epic. Zones felt organic and larger than life. Raids were daunting and breathtaking, and everything was teeming with excitement and color. Ashenvale was haunting and beautiful, Winterspring mysterious and serene, Duskwood moody and dark, and Foralis bursting with life. The Plaguelands were epic and evoked memories of Warcraft 3. Karazhan stood lonely in its valley for us to stare at and ponder, and Durotar was ruggedly cragged and hard. Back then, these were the zones we had, and we loved them dearly for their details. And sure, we all PvP'd like a bunch of dumbasses, flailing our soft, willing bodies into enemy territory. And sure, raids were sloppily thrown together and somewhat inaccessible, and loot was scarce, and everyone played like a dumbass, and classes were shoehorned into roles. But at least we had Baron's chat. You know, I just don't feel it necessary to keep going, because the original World of Warcraft is so commonly hailed and beloved that I just don't have anything else to add. This leaves only one remaining thing to talk about. You know it, you love it probably, so let's get it the fuck going.
Serve the one true king.
The one and the only Wrath of the Lich King. Fucking Arthas, Northrend, Dalaran, dragons. Oh man. Like with every entry so far, to claim Wrath as perfect is totally inaccurate. However, the reason it takes my top spot is what it achieved on a storytelling platform, as well as the intelligent sharpening of BC's ideas. While it's true that story isn't usually the focus of an MMO, WoW's expansions always have an angle that shapes and frames its content. BC prioritized the Blood Elf storyline from Warcraft 3: The Frozen Throne. Likewise, Wrath also sought to close a Warcraft 3 thread for Arthas Menethil. However, Blizzard admitted that they regretted how poorly Illidan and Kil'jaeden were handled in BC, having been stapled in unceremoniously. So in Wrath, Blizzard made sure that Arthas was properly positioned as the big threat, regardless of your previous knowledge of the game lore. It was made crystal clear that facing Arthas was the point of everything, and the entire expansion led up to a big showdown with this centralized villain, which wasn't a thing ever attempted before really, though I suppose Kael'thas was a reasonably successful experiment beforehand. Facing Arthas was a dream come true for Warcraft veterans like me, but it was also self-explanatory for new fans too, an element since copied many times over but never truly replicated. Now, so far, I've just been praising the story to high heaven, but honestly, this was a huge takeaway from this expansion. Everything felt important and exciting. Blizzard touted garrisons as being a way for the player to feel a part of the world. Well, you know what? Introducing phasing technology that let us quest through Icecrown to advance closer to Icecrown Citadel did that just fine. Immersion during Wrath of the Lich King was at its prime because of the setting of the story, largely thanks to the huge amount of setup and payoff for Arthas during Warcraft 3, and luckily for us, the expansion did not disappoint there. But let's talk mechanics and balance. 5-man dungeons were made so easy that it completely killed the crowd control aspects of the game that BC flourished on. While BC went too far in being challenging, a lot of people feel Wrath went way overboard in the opposite direction, with only Cataclysm striking the right balance. Death Knights were an excellent idea, but were, well, let's be honest, horribly integrated, spending their first months being disgustingly overpowered. Blizzard also tried really hard to make that whole 3 tank specs a thing, but failed, and DK required colossal tweaking to get them just right. I mean, it was their first ever new class, so kinks were to be expected, but Blizzard has absolutely learned from their mistakes. On the raid side, re-releasing Naxxramas was a neat idea, as previously it was only experienced by an extremely small percentage of the population, though it was disappointing that we didn't get anything original until Ulduar. It was worth the wait though, as Ulduar and Icecrown Citadel are 2 of the best raids ever made. It was a good time to be a raider, even if the BC hardcore were crying about people seeing their content. See, Wrath made it possible for people to catch up and attempt new content with every patch, unlike BC and Vanilla, where if you got left behind, you were fucked. Wrath created a fair raiding environment that gave us the opportunity on a then considered unprecedented level, which is why Wrath had the reputation of being casual friendly. On the PvP side, Wrath departed from BC's balance issues, but otherwise didn't make waves outside of giving us Wintergrasp, the first ever world PvP zone. Yeah, moving on. Rotations and class balance were in a far better place than ever before, as Blizzard dramatically improved their ability to make classes harmonious with one another, beginning the healing process of many previously useless specializations, like Survival Hunter and Retribution Paladin. Plus, Wrath gave us achievements to encourage the weird and silly stuff we players like to do, but Wrath was also really guilty of forcing players through long slogs of heroic grinds all day, which was an issue that wasn't fixed up until around Warlords of Draenor. Also, the freaking tournament crap. Wrath of the Lich King's most common criticism was really the, quote, casualization of the game, but as far as I'm concerned, that's a very poorly wrought criticism. This expansion didn't do everything perfectly, but as I've demonstrated, making a perfect MMO experience is simply not possible. All that's left at the end of the day are our memories, and Wrath was everything I wanted from the game. Blizzard churned out excellent art, excellent music, excellent gameplay, and the most memorable story. Wrath was the last era of the old WoW prior to the colossal makeovers that started with Cataclysm, making it, by my measure, the definitive WoW experience. Wrath was the apex of Blizzard's original design philosophy. Once King Arthas was laid to rest, so too was the innocence of the original World of Warcraft.
Is it over? No king rules forever, my son.
The numerous eras of WoW's history have had a great many distinctions, but there are also a great many similarities. The face and nature of this game changes all the time, and the follow-up to Legion will continue this for sure, and there are plenty of players like me who love that. But I also understand those who gave up on the game for this very reason. I play WoW because I love Blizzard's work, and I love this game. So, to reiterate my opening paragraph that you heard 40 minutes ago, these were my thoughts and reflections on a profoundly subjective gaming experience. I hope you enjoyed the video. Which expansion did you love the most? And which did you hate the most? There's no right answer, and frankly, that's what makes the debate awesome. Thanks for being a nerd with me, and I will see you in Azeroth.